Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I welcome you to the series History, Science, and Faith in Islam. In this session, we continue with the spread of Islam in the Indonesian islands. Sheikh Aulia Karim al-Makhdoom, who moved from Malacca to Mindanao in 1380, introduced Islam into the southern Philippines. His disciple, Sayyid Abu Bakr, carried on his work. In 1475, Sharif Muhammad moved from Malacca to Mindanao, where he worked tirelessly to introduce the faith. Further north, in the areas around the modern city of Manila, Sufi sheikhs carried on dawah continuously. The Spanish forcibly converted these areas to Christianity when they conquered the Philippines in 1564. The southern region of Sumatra was Islamized in the latter part of the 15th century. The islands of the Celebes and the western regions of New Guinea also embraced Islam around 1495 through the work of Sheikh Putah. Islam spread like a beacon, carried from island to island for almost 400 years. Each time the inhabitants of an island accepted Islam, they themselves became the standard bearers of the new faith and worked hard to convert others. By the time the Portuguese and the Spanish arrived on the scene in the 16th century, between 1512 and 1540 onwards, the entire archipelago was either under the sway of Islam or on its way to becoming Muslim. Islam is not just a dogma and a collection of rituals. It is a total worldview that embraces the intellect as well as the spirit. It is a paradigm shift that transforms individuals, societies, and civilizations, reshaping their horizons and remolding them in a global framework. And so it was in the East Indies. The introduction of tasawwuf into the archipelago sparked intense intellectual activity among the Malays, much as it had done earlier in Central Asia, Persia, India, Egypt, and North Africa. Debates and discussions on the spiritual aspects of tasawwuf produced some of the most sublime literature in the Malay language. Sheikh Hamza al-Fansuri, who lived in Aceh, that is in southern Sumatra, during the reign of Rihat Shah between 1589 and 1604, he is the best known of the Sufi poets of the era. The Malays were as intensely involved with discussions about Wahdat al-Wujud, which means unity of existence, as was the rest of the Islamic world at that time. The greatest exponent of the school of Tasawwuf in the Malay language was Nuruddin al-Raniri, who passed away in 1666. He belonged to the Qadariya order. It was about this time that the Quran was translated into the Malay language by Sheikh Abdul Rauf al-Sinkili, who passed away in the year 1693, and he belonged to the Shatariya order. It is also noteworthy that Aceh in northern Sumatra produced a succession of 4 Muslim queens between 1641 and 1699, starting with Sultana Tajul Alam Safiuddin Shah, 1641 to 1675. These women monarchs ruled with distinction over most of the islands of Sumatra and parts of Java and brought pride and honor to the womanhood of Islam. During the second phase of Islamic penetration, immigration from India to the East Indies increased. These migrations were helped by the growth of trade in the Indian Ocean and the pivoted role of Malabar, Gujarat, and Bengal in this trade. Muslim Indians joined the ranks of the Arabs and Persians as merchants in East Asia. When Malik Kafur, a general of Emperor Alauddin Khalji of Delhi, captured southern India circa 1300, Islam was introduced into the Deccan Plateau of India. Thereafter, many of the migrants from India to Malaya and Indonesia were Tamilian Muslims. After 1335, thanks to the vagaries of Emperor Muhammad bin Tughlaq, India split up into regional powers. Among the more powerful were the kingdoms of Gujarat, Bengal, and the Deccan Sultanates. Merchants, Sufi sheikhs, and ulama from Gujarat, Bengal, and the Makran coast of Balochistan, as well as the Deccan, made up the ranks of immigrants to the Indonesian islands. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when Great Britain controlled both India and Malaya, more Indians traveled to Malaya as soldiers and policemen. Despite these migrations, the Indian Muslims remain a small minority in both Malaya and Indonesia, although many Muslim Indo-Pakistanis intermarried with the Malays and became a part of the Islamic amalgam. In the third phase, which lasted from 1500 to 1950, the consolidation of Islam that has started in the second phase continued. Major strides were made not just in the conversion of people, but also in the evolution of culture and literature. The influence of Islam on the Malay language was profound. In India and Pakistan, the cultural impact of the Turks had resulted in the birth of a new language, Urdu. In Indonesia and Malaysia, the religious impact of the Sufis and the ulama transformed the Malay language. New alphabets were introduced into the Malay language to facilitate the pronunciation of the Quran. Arabic and Farsi words enriched the language, expanding its reach to include philosophy, theology, polemics, exposition, and the rational sciences, which facilitated the integration of the Malay peoples into the international brotherhood of Islam. The transcendence of Tawheed replaced the old worldview based on man-made deities. Language itself went through a transformation to accommodate the concepts of being and the universal community of man. In the 16th century, the Malay language had become the common medium of expression of all the Malay peoples. In Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, displacing the ancient Javanese language. It also became the medium for the propagation of the new faith throughout the islands. The third phase is also marked by the appearance of the Europeans. The Portuguese arrived first, capturing by force of arms the commercially important Straits of Malacca in 1512. The fall of Malacca forced the migration of local scholars to other islands, in turn facilitating the further spread of Islam. The experience of the archipelago with regard to its internal contacts with the Europeans was the same as that of all other littoral states in the region. Once the Portuguese had circumnavigated the coast of Africa and had established themselves in Goa, India, they embarked on a systematic campaign to destroy the important trading centers of East Africa, the Persian Gulf, Western India, the archipelago. However, it was soon obvious that Portugal had neither the manpower nor the resources to dominate the Indian Ocean. The powerful Ottoman Turks, who had by now assumed the Khilafat and were duty-bound to assist the Muslims around the globe, resisted the Portuguese aggression. Turkish naval forces engaged the Portuguese navy off the shores of East Africa and contained the advance of the Portuguese power further into the Indian Ocean. After 1550, a balance of power prevailed between Portugal and the land powers of Asia. The spirit of resistance to the European Christian invasions provided further impetus and drive to the spread of Islam in the archipelago. The next on the scene were the Spanish, who were just as ruthless as the Portuguese and were far more powerful. After expelling the Jews and the Muslims from Spain between 1492 and 1502, and destroying the ancient civilizations of the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incas in the Americas between 1500 to 1530, the Spanish made their appearance in East Asia. Magellan arrived in 1521, just about the time that the Sultan of Manila had accepted Islam, and the new faith was establishing roots in the northern islands. In 1564, the Philippines fell to the Spanish, who promptly introduced the Inquisition into the archipelago and started a process of forced conversion. The resistance of the Muslims, however, successfully contained the Spanish advance to the northern islands. The Portuguese and Spanish invasions halted the northward spread of Islam and arrested its advance into Vietnam and Indochina. A long and protracted military struggle ensued between the invading Spanish and the defending Mongol peoples, a struggle that goes on to this day in the island of Mindanao. By the 16th century, a military stalemate developed in which the island of Mindanao became the boundary between the Spanish possessions in the north and the Muslim Malay territories to the south. In the 17th century, the Dutch displaced the Portuguese as the principal colonial power in the Far East. The Dutch were as ruthless as the Portuguese and the Spaniards, waged incessant war on the Malays, captured a large number of prisoners and took them off to faraway places as far away as Cape Town, South Africa. Among the captives were many learned sheikhs, and it was these sheikhs who introduced Islam into southern Africa. The British, after consolidating their position in India between 1757 and 1806, proceeded to occupy the Straits of Malacca in 1812. In the latter part of the 19th century, the states of Southeast Asia fell one after the other to the Dutch and the British. In the ensuing struggle for independence, the Malay language provided a common bond for the peoples of Indonesia and Malaysia, and Islam was a primary vehicle for an expression of the demand for freedom. The struggle itself provided an impetus to the consolidation of Islamic influence. The faith of Islam spread, and by the turn of the 20th century, the entire archipelago had become Muslim except for the island of Bali and the isolated pocket of Singapore. Another important aspect of the third phase is the migration of the Chinese to the archipelago. Of the two pre-Islamic civilizations in Asia, those of China and India, China had by far the most political, military, technological influence on East Asia. But India had the greater religious, cultural influence. China radiated its power all across the ancient world. Chinese ambassadors were received with honor in Delhi, Samarkand, Yemen, and Cairo. In 1406, the great Chinese admiral Zheng Yi sailed the waters of the Indian Ocean with a mighty fleet as far as the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, visiting along the way the Sultanate of Java, Sri Lanka, Malabar, Yemen, and Dar es Salaam in Zanzibar. The Rajas and Sultans of Southeast Asia always saw fit to court the Chinese for trade and protection. The mass migration of Chinese to Southeast Asia was of more recent times. During the 19th century, many Chinese were brought over to work in the plantations of Malaya and Indonesia. Some came as merchants and stayed. By the end of the 19th century, the Chinese formed a third of the population of Malaya and a small but influential minority of the population of Indonesia. The area in and around the modern city of Singapore had a Chinese majority, and that city continues to be dominated by the Chinese today. Most of the Chinese immigrants were not Muslim, and it prevented them from melting into the Malayan society. Only in the interior regions of Malaysia and Indonesia were there some conversions where the Chinese occasionally married into Muslim families. It is pertinent to ask why Islam found widespread acceptance in a Hindu-Buddhist matrix in Indonesia and Malaysia, whereas in India it found only partial acceptance. Several reasons may be advanced to explain these differences. First, the process of introduction of Islam was different in India and the archipelago. During the first phase of Islamic expansion, between 622 and 1100, the commercial contacts between West Asia and the coastlines of India and Indonesia were similar. Islam made a peaceful penetration into southwestern India and the archipelago. This changed with the invasions of Mahmud of Ghazna, circa 1000, into India. The dagger of Mahmud thrust deep into India and left a legacy of bitterness which lasts to this day. Later invasions from Afghanistan and Central Asia, in search of loot from Hindustan, solidified this bitterness. In India, the ruling dynasties were primarily Turkish, Afghan, and Mughal, who looked outside the subcontinent for the roots. Except for a brief interlude in the reign of Alauddin Khalji circa 1300, Indian Muslims and Hindus did not make inroads into the Delhi courts until later in the Mughal period in the 16th century. Not so in Indonesia. There, the Hindu and Buddhist rulers themselves accepted Islam and in turn became champions of the new faith. They were Malays, not Turks and Mughals. The affinity of a people to the ruler acted as a powerful catalyst for the penetration of new ideas. Islam became a native religion in the islands from day one. It took Islam 300 years to do so in India. In the subcontinent, the faith spread through the great Sufi sheikh in spite of the opposition of the rulers and sometimes the opposition of official Qazis. The rulers were more interested in collecting taxes than in introducing Islam, while the Qazis were busy giving fatwas. The second important difference was language. In India, Farsi was the court language, as it was in the Safavid and Central Asian courts. Urdu and Hindi were native languages, but did not find acceptance as court languages. In the archipelago, Malay remained the official language, undergoing a transformation through the influence of Arabic and Persian, but remaining essentially a language of the islands. The third reason was the depth of penetration of Hindu and Buddhist cultures. In India, Hinduism had displaced Buddhism and had consolidated its hold through the work of Shankaracharya in the 7th century. The caste system was rigid and almost impenetrable. Not so in Indonesia and Indochina. There, Hinduism was a court veneer imposed from the top. Most of the population had remained animist. The caste system had not filtered down to the common folk. The religious milieu in these regions was closer to that in West Asia than India. It was easier for a universal faith like Islam to change the worldview of a people who were innately spiritual and open, as in the archipelago, than a people who were spiritual but were insulated in the rigid compartments of a hierarchical caste structure, as in India. Finally, the partial conversion of the subcontinent added another element of tension in a diverse land already divided by region, language, culture, and caste. These tensions burst forth as political military rivalries in the 18th century, just as soon as the central Muslim power in Delhi waned and then disappeared. The Europeans fully exploited these tensions to their advantage. In the archipelago, the acceptance of Islam was almost complete. The Malay peoples of Indonesia and Malaysia found in the new faith a source of national cohesiveness and universal solidarity. This concludes our session on the introduction of Islam into Indonesia. In the next session, inshallah, we will cover the introduction of Islam into Malaysia. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.